All right, continuing from where we left off. So last time we built out some of our testing infrastructure and created our initial database schema. Now, I didn't mention it, I should have mentioned it at the beginning. So we're manually creating this schema and defining our tables and indexes and things. And I'm going to manually implement using JDBC, our database query and update code. I do prefer doing it manually compared to using something like Hibernate or any kind of JPA and having some of that stuff automatically happen for you. I like better control over what the database does and when and how it generates its queries. And yes, it's probably more work in the end, especially if you have a giant database schema with 100 different databases or tables in it, and you need to implement kind of all the code for all that. You can simplify a lot and pull a lot of this code out into base classes, and we'll probably end up doing that, even though we only have 2 tables that we're going to work with. But overall, I prefer it. JDBC is not that difficult. It's pretty straightforward to get up and running correctly. And so yeah, I probably should have said that at the beginning, but I'm not going to use any kind of ORM tool to do this database stuff. I'm just going to type it in and then test it thoroughly in our test module here and see what happens. All right, so let's go ahead and let's implement truncate first, because in our extension we're already invoking truncate kind of in between each test to make sure we're starting fresh with each every time we run a test to make sure it starts out as empty. So okay, let's so kind of what all these methods are going to look like. We're going to fetch a connection from our data source. All of these are going to have to catch SQL exception. I'm just going to turn around and rethrow them as runtime exceptions. Like this. And then within here, so our string that defines the SQL we want to run. In this case, delete from, and then our table name. Let me actually split this down so we can see it. So right now we're in the to-do list service. Our table name is to-do lists. All right, we're gonna want a prepared statement. Actually, and I can do it this way. I'll rename this to con just so it's a little bit shorter. All right, and then so we don't need to set any parameters in our prepared statement. So pretty much we can just ps.execute update and then return what this method returns. This method returns the number of rows that were modified. Actually, it doesn't. Either 1, the row count for DML statements, or 0. Okay, this was a little bit confusing. The 1 here is in parentheses, so 1 is the first option, 2 is the second option. So it's going to return the row count of statements that were executed, basically. So I'm pretty sure that means that if we have 10 to-dos in here, we're going to end up with 10 being returned. But we can verify that when it comes to implementing our tests. All right, so that one looks good. I'm starting at the bottom, so I'll just work my way up. So to delete, now notice this is the only method that doesn't take a principal, because for truncate, we're going to delete everything from the database, not just things for a specific user. Let me drag this down a little bit. All right, so in this case, we want to delete a specific list for a specific user. So we'll say delete from to-do list where user ID is the principal, effectively, and the ID is the ID that we're going to pass in. So in this case, we need to set string our first parameter. This is 1 based, not 0 based. So we're going to use 1 here for the principal.get. Name and user are the same, but I'm going to use user throughout. And the second one is the ID. And then we're going to do the same update, and we're only returning true or false here whether the row was actually deleted or not. So if we've deleted one record, then this is going to return 1. And if 1 is greater than 0, we're going to return true. So this should work the way we want it to. And I'm going to change this error to fail to delete list. All right, so this looks pretty good so far. Let's come up here. Actually, before we go any further, let's go ahead and, well, I guess I have to implement more of these. I was going to say let's build a test for this, but I can't really delete anything until I can add things. So I guess we'll keep going. Copy paste this. So for our update, we're going to say update to-do list set. Really the only thing that we're going to allow to be updated is the name. And we'll say where user ID is at and ID is at. And I'll also tack on here a name is not equal to the to-do list name. So basically, we're only going to return true if we've actually modified the to-do list. If the to-do list already had the specified name, we're going to return false. Okay, so the parameters here are going to be the name first, right, which is this one, and we are going to want another name down toward the end. Second is the user ID, third is the ID, and then we've got these numbers here, so I'm going to do index equals 0, and I'll say plus index. That will prevent issues, you know, for just 1 and 2. I think it's okay, but I don't know, maybe I should be consistent and do the same thing down here. All right. So this looks pretty good. I'll say failed to update list on error. Let's go ahead and copy this. So we'll insert into to-do lists. The values we want to put in are user ID, ID, and name. And then we'll have 3 question marks in here. We don't need that one. So that way we'll get our user, our ID, and then our name in that order. Now, we'll have to think about what we want to do with conflicts. Let's see, SQLite insert conflict. Yeah, so there is an on conflict, and then we can choose to do certain things depending on what behavior we want. So basically, if a user has already created a list with that ID and or that name, like what should we do? Should we ignore this insert and not do anything, or should we do a replace and update, you know, the name to the new one? So basically, should we treat this like a save, or should it actually be a create? And so we can kind of decide what we want here. I think I'm going to do fail and return basically a 409 response, which is on conflict, or 409 means conflict. So that's my natural inclination, is to, that effectively means the user is doing something that they might not intend. They're attempting to create something that already exists. So we can return a 409 to tell them that there is a conflict, that what they are attempting to create does already exist. So we can say on conflict fail. Well, at least that's what the syntax looks like, I believe. Yeah, on conflict fail. All right, so let's update this to fail to create list. We'll have to test this on conflict fail and see what exception we get here, and make sure we handle it correctly in the REST endpoint. We'll worry about that later. All right, so let's copy this. Select star from to-do lists. Where user ID equals that. And we'll specify the user. We don't need, we'll just use a 1 here. So now we'll need to process the result set. Oops. All right, so let's create a list here to hold our results. So for each result in this result set, we're going to want to turn it into a to-do list. So we could say to-do list.add new to-do list. I'll spread this out a little bit. And then the .id is going to be rs.getString ID. And the name's going to be name. Will all this fit on one line? Looks like it does. Okay, that's probably good enough. All right, in this case, we want where not only the user ID is equal to the principal, but and the ID is the list that was passed in. Alright, and now we're not going to return a list, so I can get rid of that, and I can turn this while into an if. Alright, so I forgot to update these. Failed to fetch list and failed to fetch lists. Okay, this seems like it would work pretty well just by looking at it. Let's go ahead and create a test to try it out and see what happens. I'll ignore that. All right, we need a new package, and we'll create a new integration test class. We'll have, we need a data source, so let's extend with our data source extension. That's not what I wanted. I want to add constructor parameter. Okay, so test. I'll just do that for now, just so the compile stuff disappears. Let's move this down to here. All right, so in fact, let's update this to say SQL to list service. And we don't really need the data source, we need the service that we're going to use. Alright, so let's test get first with no lists. So we can do to list service. Oops. We're going to need a principal for all these, so let's go ahead and create a principal. Alright, and then we can assertions.assert false. We can assert false that it's not present, or I guess we could assert true. Maybe that's a little bit more straightforward. True that it's empty, or false that it's present. That's confusing. Anyway, test get with no list. Let's also test with long list. So what I mean by that is we'll have a list in the to-do service, but it's going to have a different ID. Maybe I should say wrong ID. So let's create a new to-do list with an ID and a name. These parameters don't really matter that much. We can assert true. Of course, the one I want isn't immediately obvious. Let's assert true that to-do list service dot create with this wrong ID actually returns true, which means something was inserted. And then if we fetch with the wrong ID, actually maybe I should make that ID and make that column. We're still expecting to not get a result back. We can also say wrong principal. In fact, let's move this one up here. And let's create another principal. I'll fix that in a second. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to create it for principal 1, and then we're going to search for it under principal 2, and we'll let's fix this. We'll just call it list. Okay, so we're inserting the list as principal 1, and then we're attempting to fetch the list as principal 2. So this should also not return anything. All right, and then in this case, we'll insert it as principal 1. We'll fetch it as principal 1. The ID is correct, so in this case, it should be present, and it should assert equals list fetch.get. So the one that we fetch should be identical to this one that we have here. All right, let's go ahead and run this and see what breaks. Okay, lots of things. SQL syntax error. It didn't like the fail syntax that I had. Not there. Let me close that. It's actually in this one. Yeah, when I'm inserting, I've got on conflict fail. So it didn't seem to like that. On conflict fail. Not sure why. I'll just remove that for now and see what happens. Maybe we can get an example. Oh, maybe it's... so this is a little bit different. Let's just upsert. Alright, which one failed? Get with one list. So it didn't actually find it. This is the one that we expected it to find it, and it didn't. So list.id. Oh, I think I know what the problem was. Let me open this back up. So I have auto commit turned off in my testing code that I closed out. Data source extension, I've got auto commit false here, which means in my service here, when I do connection things, I need to actually do a commit at the end. Otherwise, that commit doesn't get saved. So some of these are read-only, right? Like this get is read-only, so no commit is necessary there. This get is read-only. This insert definitely makes a change. So let's say if we actually updated something, we can say connection.commit, return true, and then return false here. And we'll need the same kind of behavior here when we actually do an update, and we'll do the same thing here. And then our truncate as well. Now this returns an int. So I'll say int deleted something like that. All right, so now if I run this again, there we go, all greens. So, so far we've only really tested fetching one. In the next one, I'll add a bunch more tests for the other methods that we implemented, and we'll go from there. In the meantime, I'll research that on conflict fail and see what's going on there. Well, we'll need that when it comes time to actually test our insertions with create. Right now we're just doing simple creates just to have data in there to test fetching, but we'll have more tests for create to see what happens when we do things like insert with conflicts and things like that. So we'll continue these tests next time. Thanks a lot. Like, share, subscribe, comment, all that YouTube stuff, and I'll see you in the next one.